All right, before we dive into the text, I've got a couple of questions that I would like to ask of you. Actually, I would say a question or three. Question number one. Have you ever grieved? You know the word, right? Grieved. Grieved. Have you ever grieved? Grief is actually just a word that means deep sorrow. We usually associate that with someone's death, but quite frankly, it can be in other areas of life. We can grieve finances. We can grieve loss of reputation. We can grieve the loss of close friends, either by death or just separation. We can grieve the loss of a keepsake. Has everybody been with a child who couldn't find what my kids call a stuffed animal? They misplace it. And in their small mind, they have lost all, and grief is heavy on them. Oftentimes, this concept of grief is heavier on those who are older. You've lived more life and you've had more chances for opportunity. But it can occur among the younger as well. It's usually associated with some loss. Older persons, many have faced spousal loss, or they've faced sibling loss, or cousin loss, or longtime friend loss. The fact of the matter is, in the United States, 2.5 million people die each year. And the statistics show that for every death, there's 5 grieving persons that are associated with that. So do the math. In a given year, there are 12.5 million persons who are confronted with just the death of someone close. 1.5 million children in the United States, that's 5% of the children in the United States, have lost one or both parents by the time they're 15 years old. If you've ever been through grief, you know this. It's most difficult in those first 2 weeks after. And for most persons, there tends to be a regaining of the rhythm of life after that. There's a re-entry back into normal activity. But for some, it's not that simple. There's a concept thought of as complicated grief. A scenario where you're overwhelmed in your emotions and you just have a difficult time functioning. Often this is associated and followed by depression and anxiety. A Psychiatric Times publication says that 40% of grievers are still experiencing major depression 1 month after. And as many as 24% are still grieving 2 months after, whatever the incident that caused the grief was. So I ask again, have you ever grieved? And when you did, how did you manage and how did you cope? Question number 2, what do you fear? What do you fear? Louette and I went to a birthday party for a dear friend who turned 60 yesterday. And they did this little game where you had to, how much do you know her? And in the game, one of the questions was, what is her greatest fear? Ask yourself that. What's your greatest fear? Her answer was a loved one being hurt. You can identify with that, can't you? I don't know what your fear is. It could be just pain. Maybe you just don't want to hurt. Maybe your fear is loneliness. You don't want to be alone. Maybe you're scared of heights. Or maybe you're claustrophobic. Chances are either of those fears are probably wrapped around just an ultimate fear of your demise, your death. Maybe you, like my friend, you fear the pain in those that you love. So question number 2, what do you fear? Question number 3, when you grieve and when you fear, what do you, or could I say, what will you turn to in those moments? There's tons of options that have been tried. Many people, when they face grief or fear, they turn to just, I want to numb myself. You can do that through any number of ways. You can use substances. You can pursue mindless distractions. Some in those moments end up turning to guilty pleasures. Another way of coping with these anxieties, this grief, this fear, it might be that it's anger. You ever seen somebody who's going through grief and or fear and they're just mad? They cope via rage or through the self-pity that leads them to be angry at life in general, and more specifically, they'll pick out a person that they think's responsible, and down underneath it, there's probably an anger at God himself for allowing that to happen. Some people cope through self-pity. It's like victimhood becomes my identifier. And I'm just going to sit here and just, poor me, woe is me, feel sorry for me. So where do you turn? And where should you go when that happens? The text we're going to look at today is a pivotal point in Matthew's gospel. It's actually right in the middle. It actually shows a shift that's going to occur. Everything up until now has primarily been a ministry in Galilee. And we're getting ready to move with a focus towards the passion in Jerusalem. Doesn't mean all the activity goes to Jerusalem, but the focus is going to change. This middle passage in Matthew chapter 14 is actually marked by John the Baptist's death. And you can see in this, there's a literary connector. You've got John the Baptist's death here in chapter 14 at the hands of Herod. It's similar to back in chapter 2, you had Herod again with what's called the death of the innocents. You remember when he sent to Bethlehem and every child under 2 slaughtered. And you got a connector at the end of the gospel in Matthew chapter 27 where Jesus himself is crucified. But actually, it's not just a literary pivotal point here. There's a pivotal point here in regards to the intensity of the gospel's narrative and message. Jesus has faced some rejection up to this point. You remember the stories that have happened so far. We've actually watched authorities try to trap him. But most of those interactions have been responded to with some fabulous answer from Jesus that basically caused them to, I don't have anything else to say. But we're getting ready to move from rejection being just a trap or just a question or just, I might not like what you're doing, into fatal and fundamental loss. It's already been hinted at back in chapter 12 where Jesus' mom and his brothers come and want to see him. And it's got the insinuation of, look, you're out of hand. You need to calm down. But Jesus gives a fabulous answer there. Hey, who's my brother? Who's my sister? Who's my mother? It's those who are with me. And it moves on. The end of chapter 13, after the parables that we spoke about last week, actually, you end up having Jesus going back to his hometown. And when he goes to his hometown, he teaches in the synagogue. And when he teaches in the synagogue, the people who are there listening to him say, man, this guy's amazing. Where did he learn this stuff? But listen to where it goes. We know him. He's Joseph's boy. We know his brothers, and all of his sisters are here with us. Who is he? Text actually ends up with Jesus not doing many miracles there because of their disbelief in his own hometown. So just imagine the feeling of rejection. In chapter 14, we open this chapter and see this central connector being the death of the forerunner. John the Baptist is meeting his demise in those first 12 verses. So it's within this big picture that Matthew is going to take us through what he writes here in chapter 14 of his gospel. There's 3 connected accounts in this chapter that Matthew shares to give us a real and a comprehensive perspective about not just life, but who Jesus is. So I want you to follow. The first connected story is that story I just mentioned, John the Baptist's death. It's in the first 12 verses. He's going to move from there to actually a second story, which we're all probably familiar. It's in every one of the four Gospels, and that is Jesus feeding the 5,000. You'll see that in verses 13 through 21. And then thirdly, he connects a story to that, which is Jesus walking on the water in verses 22 to 33 that were read earlier. And we're going to give special attention to that story and its application to our life this morning. So, if you will, follow the story with me. In verses 1 through 12, John the Baptist, who's already been mentioned in Matthew's gospel a couple of times, he's back on the scene. And this is a tale of tragic proportion. It's disappointing to people who seek to do what's right, like John the Baptist, and who want to share what's real and what's true. And I'm going to take an aside here with just a quick statement. I want you to make a note. Doing what is right does not always end well in this world. At least not in the short run. And sometimes doing what's right actually comes with great cost. You see, in John's case here, John the Baptist, Herod, who is the local governing authority, is at odds with John. You might ask, why is he at odds with John? Well, he's at odds with John not because of his preaching and his crowds. He's at odds with John because John has confronted him, the ruler, on the grounds of his sexual impropriety and the incest that was practiced with his brother's wife. So Herod ends up imagining some bizarre stuff like this famed Jesus. It's actually John the Baptist come back from the dead. And you might be wondering, why would he say that? Well, here's why. He said that because he had taken John and put him in prison because of the ruckus John was causing with the confrontation over his relationship with the mistress. He put him in prison and not to death. It's not that he was above that. He had killed all those children in Bethlehem earlier, remember? But he didn't put him to death because he feared the people. The people thought John was a prophet. And he knew this will not be a politically wise move for me to go and take this guy's life. The people love him. Amazing, some things never change, right? People do what they do based on what it's going to give to them. But the twisted plot thickens as Herodias, which is Herod's mistress, has her daughter come and dance for Herod at Herod's birthday party. And Herod makes this rash promise in a delusionally pleased state with this girl's dancing, saying, I'll give you whatever you ask. So the girl ends up asking, to Herod's surprise, for John's head on a platter. I mean, if you're hearing this the first time, you should be repulsed. That is disgusting that you would ask for such a thing. The story ends with John's death. Herod has a bunch of people who heard him give the promise, and he has to come through. So John is dead. His disciples go and take his body and bury him, and then his disciples go to tell Jesus. Again, remember, the purpose of Matthew's gospel is not just stories. It's a validation of Jesus as the Messiah, as the promised deliverer. So in verses 13 through 20, we move from the death of John to the second episode in chapter 14, and it spins the story forward, and it reveals a crucial insight into who Jesus is. My guess is in this gathering of people, most everybody has heard the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But I want us to watch for the connections to John's death in this feeding and the insights that we're going to get into who Jesus is. Now, when Jesus heard the news that John had died there in verse 12 of chapter 14, what would you imagine his response to be? Again, what would your response be? I mean, there had been an unjust execution of his kin. It's his cousin. It had been the unjust execution of a righteous person, a person who was seeking to live life rightly with God and man. And after this execution, it looks like the wicked are just carrying on. Herod's got what he wants. Anyone in here in that moment, would you be prone to anger? Or maybe resentment? Or perhaps bitterness? What should our response be? And actually, when you look in the text, the helpful thing is, what would you expect Jesus' response to be, and what is it actually? So look at Jesus. Look at verse 13. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Do you see what Jesus does? He withdraws to a desolate place by himself. Here's, in case you have these fanciful ideas about who Jesus is that are erroneous, let me present to you. Jesus grieved. As any person would do at such a loss, at such an atrocity, Jesus grieved. Here's something you need to know about Jesus. Jesus is 100% man. He is incarnate. He is in flesh. He is real and physical just as much as you and I are. And he was touched with every single pain that you and I are touched with, except he was touched in a way that did not produce sin in him. Hebrews chapter 2. Because he's a man, that means Jesus has emotions. He experiences grief at the death of a loved one. So I want to again take a little aside and just encourage you with this. Grief is right and good. See, here's the reality. Our sin and the curse that's come with it, it has brought the robbery of life and death, of life, and made it experience death. Death among us is not right. And when death occurs, it hurts. Here's the deal. Many of you in this room, I know you have griefs. Many of you probably are grieving right now. I want you to just know this. If you're in that place, Jesus understands. He's been there. So what do we do with our grief? How should we respond when life deals us suffering or sorrow? I want you to look at the action verbs of what it is that Jesus did, and this is going to be phenomenally helpful, I do believe. In verse 13, you're going to see that Jesus withdraws to a desolate place. But he doesn't just stay there. In verse 14, he goes ashore, and it says that he saw a great crowd. And what's his response to that? He had compassion on that great crowd. And he actually moved forward to heal those in that great crowd. He didn't just do that. At the end of the long day, he actually invites them to stay. The disciples come and say, hey, look, these guys have been here all day. You need to send them home so they can get something to eat. And Jesus says, no, invite them to stay. In fact, why don't you feed them? Give them something to eat. Again, note this. Jesus' response to grief. In the midst of his grief and his sorrow and his loss, his heart maintained an awareness of others and their hurts and their loss. Jesus had compassion on the crowd. You realize probably many in that crowd had affection for John the Baptist too. And Jesus sought to heal them, even though his cousin John didn't get healing. He got death. He even, while looking for some time alone, invited the crowd to stay. He didn't just invite them to stay, he fed them. And ultimately, if you look down at verse 22, he's the last one to stay to dismiss the crowd. His disciples go before he leaves. So what's the upshot of all of that? A miracle occurs. A miracle occurs. Jesus chooses to show the evidence of his stature as the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, with these people. People who came to hear, people who came to be healed, not people who came to trap him and dismiss him. Jesus cares for them out of his human compassion for them and out of his divine capability. So he takes very ordinary means. You know the story. He takes bread and he takes fish. And he serves an extraordinary number of people, 5,000 plus when you have women and children included. This is ironic. That which he would not do for the Pharisees who came and asked him for a miracle, and that which he would not do in his own hometown because of their unbelief, he does it here in abundance. After all, everyone ate until they were satisfied. Even if the Mattern boys had come that day, there'd be plenty to eat. And there's leftovers. So here we are back at miracles and crowds like we saw back in chapter 8, chapter 9, and so forth. So what's next? What is Jesus' heart? What is he about? And that brings us to our focal passage for today. Our focal text for the day follows on the news of John's death at Herod's hand and of Jesus' compassion to the crowd in feeding 5,000. And Matthew's going to connect this next episode to those episodes. So there's 5 quick observations I want to make about that, and then we're going to bring it home and apply it, okay? So Matthew chapter 14, the text that Gwendolyn read for us in verses 22 to 33, has 5 observations to note. Observation number 1, verses 22 and 23, Jesus continued to grieve. I want you to note something. Jesus didn't have to be over his grief in order to serve, care, and sacrifice for others. I don't want you to make any mistake. He still needed time alone with his Father. I don't know if we don't know what happens during that evening after the crowd's dismissed. Maybe he's contemplating and mourning his loss of his cousin and the forerunner, John the Baptist. Maybe watching what happened to John the Baptist is making him think about and consider what lays ahead of him at the cross. So after he served everybody, he went and he prayed alone. However, even as he does that, life still continues, doesn't it? So in the midst of his solitude, we see, second observation, this. The disciples need a rescuer. Verses 24 to 25. See, Jesus said, hey, you guys, get in the boat and go on back over to the other side while I dismiss the crowd, and then he was going to go in the mountain to pray. Well, while the disciples are on a boat on their way back home, it's been a long day, it's late, the text tells us that the winds begin to beat against the boat. So much so that they are in obvious trouble. The text tells us that it's in the 4th watch. We don't understand 4th watch. Do you know what the 4th watch is? I don't know what the 4th watch is. Well, here's what the 4th watch is from looking it up. It's 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. It's the way they broke up military guard. They'd have 4 watches during the night, and they didn't make you stay up all night. You stayed up for that span. So from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. is the 4th watch. And it says in this text that it's in the 4th watch that this storm came up, and it was beating on them. What that helps us understand is Jesus had taken the first watches of the night, 1, 2, and 3, alone with his Father. But the disciples on the water in the dark of the night are in an obvious struggle. So what does Jesus do? Well, the text tells us here. The text tells us that Jesus, seeing this, came to them. Don't miss that. Jesus is grieving. His forerunner has lost his head. But aware of the need in others in time and space, he comes to them. And how is it that he comes? He comes to them walking on the water. Now again, if you've not read this or heard this story before, you should be shocked. Walking on water? He's a man, right? No man can walk on water. The physics don't work. But Jesus, in this moment of caring for his disciples, He defies, or actually the better word would be, he supersedes the natural order in order to reveal his glory and to care for his own. Along with that, think about this. Jesus, we had already said this, Jesus has refrained from miracles for his homeboys back in Nazareth, and he's refrained from it with his own family. But for his own, for these disciples, he lays down his grief, he lays down the temptation to become self-absorbed in his grief, and instead he comes and he offers rescue. So observations seen so far, we see that Jesus continued to grieve, number one, and then number two, we see that the disciples need a rescuer, and that brings us to verses 26 through 27, where we see this. The disciples in that moment are afraid. The disciples are afraid. They're concerned over the chaos before them, the storm, a capsized vessel, potentiality of drowning. It's actually compounded now with the fear of spiritual darkness. Look at the text there in verses 26 through 27. And what you'll see is that they see Jesus who's now coming to them walking on the water. And what is it that they surmise that they're seeing? Oh my goodness, it's a ghost. It's a haunt. It's a spook. We're scared to death of this. The storms and the death of drowning is one thing, but now the spiritual world's coming at me. I mean, they've seen a lot of stuff from Jesus, right? They've watched a lot of miracles. They just saw him feed 5,000 people. But they've never seen him walk on water. Men swim. They don't walk on water. But Jesus recognizes their fear, and Jesus steps in and listen to his words. He says, "Take heart. It is I. Do not fear." In compassion, in that moment of chaos, he cares for the fear in his disciples' hearts. It's fascinating, is it not? Jesus is walking on water. It's miraculous. And instead of him saying, "Hey guys, look at this. Watch me. I can walk on water," his focus has nothing to do with his miraculous exhibition. His focus has everything to do with those disciples who are fearing. Jesus knows that the hope for their fear and courage is his person. So he declares, "It is I." Let me put this down as something you might can understand. Has anybody ever had children in here, or anybody ever been a child who's had night terrors? What comforts that child? You know what it is? It's for the parent to come and say, "It's okay, I'm here." Jesus is declaring to them this same thing. He knows them, they know him, he's present now in their trouble. With this presented hope that is Jesus present with them and not some haunted spirit, Peter then is going to decide to test the truth. Yep, that's good old Peter. We know about him and how he acts. So Peter's going to test this truth, and he calls out and asks Jesus, "Hey, Lord, if it's you, command me and let me come out on the water." And what we're going to find out here is a fourth observation, and that's this. The disciples' faith is weak. Jesus, who came to them, when Peter says, "Let me come to you," you know what he does? He invites Peter to come on out to him in faith. Come on. And what happens when what happens then? We usually focus on one part of it, right? And that's Peter going down. That's kind of our go-to. We're negative. We focus on, but what did Peter do first? He actually walked on the water, didn't he? I mean, Peter gets a bad rap, but he actually got out of the boat. None of the others got out of the boat. Peter got out of the boat. Incredible fear, incredible faint hearts, tired from a long day, and Peter steps out of the boat. But just like you and me, he takes that initial step of faith and oftentimes becomes distracted by the winds, and fear returns. And guess what happens when fear and the possibility of failure comes? You go down. This is a beautiful part. Instead of Jesus standing there on the water watching you go, say, "Bro, if you'd have just trusted, it wouldn't have happened. What's wrong with you?" He responds to Peter's reply, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reaches out and he takes hold of him. I want you to hear this. You and I are unable on our own. Your faith is not strong enough. But he's totally able in spite of your faithlessness. And when we lose focus, his eye is riveted on us. He has compassion and a real perspective in the middle of the storm. And what do I mean by real perspective? Here's what I mean by real perspective. He doesn't just say, come on and good job. He looks at him and says, why did you doubt? Why do you have such little faith? It's not like they've not been in this situation before. Matthew 8, you remember the story? Jesus, instead of walking on the waters, asleep in the boat, right? And the same thing happened. Storm comes up, and what did Jesus do? He tells the storm, be still. When he did that, the disciples, the way the text puts it, they were amazed and asked themselves, what kind of dude is this? But their assessment goes deeper this time. Their assessment in our fifth observation from this text goes here. It says, the disciples see and declare he is the very Son of God. This is the crux of the passage today. If you haven't listened so far, please hear now. It is what we need to learn from Matthew's gospel about who Jesus is and about how disciples should respond. The text tells us that the disciples do respond. And in that last verse, it says, those in the boat worshiped him. I want you to note another thing. Remember earlier in the service, we said Jesus grieved and he's 100% man. Here's something that's boggling to the mind. He's also 100% God. He's not part man and part God like some Greek deity. And he's not really close to God like Moses, who spoke to God face to face. No, as the creeds, which we spoke of earlier, would declare, he is very God of very God. Just think about it. This would be scandalous, and it's what the Pharisees accuse as blasphemy. If Jesus wasn't God, for them to worship would have been idolatry. And if it's idolatry, then Jesus is guilty of usurping the true God. But no, I want you to understand, he is God. He's 100% God. And they worshiped him. That worship is clarified with this declaration about who Jesus is. They say, truly, you are the Son of God. If you want to know what Matthew's been driving at, this is what it is. You see this moniker, Son of God? This is known from the Old Testament to be the one who is promised to come and break the curse and redeem the people of God. We're going to see more next week in Matthew chapter 16, but it's true to grasp the realization that dawns upon the disciples. Hey, Jesus, yes, you're a teacher. Yes, you're a miracle worker. Yes, you are wise and you are full of kindness, but this goes further. You are the very Messiah, the Son of God, very God of very God. You may be missing some, and maybe it's long and maybe you've lost focus, but I hope what can happen here is this, that you can see what Matthew in his text is begging for us to grasp for ourselves. He is declaring as loudly and now as clearly as he possibly can that Jesus of Nazareth is the promised rescuer. He's making a case. He's appealing to us with the disciples in this case. Believe. Have faith. Trust me. What do we do with this? 3 quick challenges to our understandings about Jesus, and they will be quick. 3 points of application, and each one's going to build upon itself in importance to think through as we leave here this afternoon. Application number 1. How do you grieve? How do you grieve? Do you suppress it? Are you debilitated by it? What we've been seeing in the text is screaming to us that we are most like Jesus when we care for others out of our suffering. actually in our suffering. Application number 2. What do you fear? I don't know what you're afraid of. Death, abandonment, bad circumstances. This text is appealing for us to understand. We are most trusting of Jesus when we remember his sovereignty over all and his compassion for us in that. Application question number 3. What do you worship? Could be the question we asked at first. Where do you turn when you grieve and fear? Same idea. What do you worship? Do you worship stuff? Do you worship success? Do you worship status? Do you worship just your own self? Please hear this. We are most truly worshiping that which is worthy of worship when we see Jesus, the Lord of all, the Messiah, the rescuer of our souls, come for us. Turn to him and worship him. I pray that as we leave here today, that we can avoid cliches and casual acknowledgments of who Jesus is. And instead, we can walk away from this text not just enamored with a cool story, but amazed. The text is begging us, fix our eyes on him. Let's join him in our consecration to the relationship with him and with our relationship with each other. And let's worship that which is worthy of worship.